Good evening and welcome to the Dalí for our ongoing lecture series. Tonight we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Sheramy Bundrick, Professor of Art History at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg campus, for her talk, Entering Van Gogh's World. One of Dr. Bundrick's contributions to the conversation around Van Gogh is this wonderful novel, Sunflowers. And I thought it might be nice to share a few of the plaudits that this novel has received. A knockout debut novel, Bundrick brings Vincent van Gogh's paintings and personal story to vibrant life, an impressive volume of suspense, delight, and heartbreak from Publishers Weekly. Bundrick's well-executed historical fiction debut will appeal to readers interested in artists and the dark forces that shape their fates. Book list. And Sheramy Bundrick, an art historian writing her first novel, is up to the task. She conjures a poignant but ill-fated romance in 1888 Arles, France, between the mentally fragile painter and an obscure historical figure, a prostitute named Rachel, from USA Today. So I hope that underscores a little bit how lucky we are to have her here with us tonight, speaking about not only this novel, but the broader topic of how we might enter Van Gogh's world. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, we have a partnership with Tombolo Books, and Dr. Bundrick has very kindly gone to Tombolo and has signed some copies. So those are available there. During the lecture, if people could remember to just hold questions till the end, we are going to have an opportunity for Q&A afterwards, both with people who are here in-house and with our live stream audience on YouTube. So we'll have that available. Now, of course, in addition to this wonderful topic of Van Gogh, Dr. Bundrick's work is much more ample than that. She's been teaching at the University of South Florida since 2001 after earning her PhD at Emory University. And her focus, despite this novel's topic being 19th century artist and art, her actual focus academically is on ancient Greek art as her research specialty. But she has been a fan of Vincent van Gogh for almost as long as she studied Greek vases. In addition to Sunflowers, she's the author of Music and Image in Classical Athens and Athens, Etruria, and the Many Lives of Greek Figured Pottery. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sheramy Bundrick.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that very kind introduction. I am so excited to be here today, speaking to you about one of my favorite topics, other than Greek pottery, Vincent van Gogh. And I am going to use the American pronunciation of his name. That's just a little bit easier. And I definitely want to thank Kim and the Dalí Museum for inviting me to come over. I didn't have to come very far since I teach over there. But oddly enough, it is the first time I've spoken here. So that makes this kind of a historic day. And it's also a very exciting day for me because it has been almost a year since I have been in a real room with real humans teaching and lecturing without a mask on. So that makes this very liberating for me in all kinds of ways, in addition to walking down, the Van Gogh memory lane. So it's very exciting. So tonight in my talk of about, far too short, 30, 40 minutes, we'll see, I'm going to attempt to give you some thoughts about entering into Van Gogh's world. And I decided to take a left brain, right brain approach to this question. Left brain meaning the scholarship side of things, and right brain meaning more the creative fiction side of things. And my own relationship with him, and I am going to use that word, is very much left brain, right brain itself. So it's very fun for me to explore both of those with you. I did choose this idea of entering into Van Gogh's world because that's what you're doing when you go to the exhibition upstairs. And those of you who are not in the Tampa Bay area, hopefully you will get the chance to see one of these shows that is making its way around. I think one is opening in Atlanta very soon, for example. And when you go in that show, you are immersed in Van Gogh's work on a very large scale and getting to plunge into that space. So I'm fascinated with this idea of entering into his world. Now, of course, Van Gogh is the most famous artist on the planet. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. Even people who have never been in a museum before, even little kids, know who he is. And a lot of people can probably name some paintings by him. And if I were to launch a massive opinion poll online or something, I bet I would find that about 75% of people would pick one of these as the work they're most likely to know. And in fact, I was intrigued to see that these two paintings get sort of the special section in the gift shop, which didn't surprise me at all, that it's these two, not a bit. And of course, there are certain works by him that are more famous than others, it is true. I'm very interested in this idea of the irony behind Van Gogh's fame today. And so much money is spent on paintings and drawings when they come up for sale, for example. I just read yesterday one of his paintings from Paris is going up for auction in about a month, and the estimate is something like $30 million. So yeah, I heard a wow in the audience. So, lots of money. People do know things about him, know about his biography. People know the famous things that happened to him. And of course, scholars have enormous amounts of material to work with on Van Gogh, more perhaps than certainly a lot of artists leading up to 1900. We have so much source material. But at the same time, there's so much that's not known about him, or that is not understood very well, or is misunderstood by people. He's just as subject as anybody to internet rumors, I've discovered. So how can we enter into Van Gogh's world and try to understand him better? So let's take a step first into the left brain and think about scholarship. So I have here some very arbitrary categories to do with researching Van Gogh. And these are incredibly arbitrary. I literally just made them up. But they all work together in a very cohesive way and flow together so that research centered on Van Gogh can take lots of different avenues. And I tell you, every year it seems like there are new books, new articles, new things to read, exciting new discoveries. My book actually came out in 2009. It has been a while, so it really has been memory lane for me this week. And yet, in the last decade, there have been just incredible new things that almost make me wish I could write it again and add in some of the new stuff that's been discovered even since that time. And just to give you a couple of little things, and then I've got 3 case studies to tell you about. For one thing, under documentary research, there has been a brand new translation of Van Gogh letters. That came out actually in 2009, right after my book did. And you could find that online, open access, anyone can go and see it. It's sponsored by the Van Gogh Museum. I've got the website coming up. It's vangoghletters.org. And there you could see digital facsimiles of the pages that he wrote on, which are actually pretty small, but you can see them, high resolution on your screen. You can read an English translation. You can read the transcription in the original language. You can, there are little links to the paintings that are mentioned in the letter. It's an incredible resource that is right there at your fingertips. Another very exciting technological advance that has happened, and this project began around 2007, has to do with technique and studio practice. And that's where a lot of the new work has been, actually, is in that area. And this has to do with counting the threads on his canvases. The Van Gogh Museum and their partners developed a program that allows them to do that. It's a computer program that counts the threads on the canvas and looks for the patterns, and it goes into a database. And the reason why that's really cool is you can analyze a painting and then see, get an idea which paintings were made at the same time because they were made on the same roll of canvas. And that's incredible. You can also authenticate paintings that way, by the way. Those Van Goghs that everybody says they have in their attic. So that kind of research and those kinds of new advances really just change our picture all the time. So I picked 3 fun little case studies to give you a very good examples of some of the scholarly research that has been done. So this is another one of the super famous paintings. Again, if I were to poll people, this one might be in the top 5 that people would know. This was done in October 1888. This was done at Arles in Provence in the south of France. This is one of 3 paintings of Vincent's bedroom. This is the first one that he did. The other two are in the Art Institute of Chicago and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. So some of you watching may have seen one of the three. This one's in Amsterdam. And the other two were done about a year after this one. This one was done first. This painting is actually in pretty bad condition. It was subject to some damage even while he had it in Arles because of a flood from the river and dampness in the house while he was in the hospital in spring 1889. This painting was there, and it was damaged and started to flake. So it was already in some trouble even while he still had it. But even since then, something very dramatic has happened to it in terms of the colors. Now, when you look at this now, or you look at the other two, you look at those walls, you look at the doors, and they're blue. And you could stare at it all day and just be absolutely convinced it's blue. But here's the thing. In his own letters, he gives us a totally different story. So there on the right is one of these facsimile letters. So I did copy that right off the website. This page is in the Morgan Library in New York, and it is a page from a letter from Van Gogh to Paul Gauguin. Now, I heard a couple of noises in the audience. Some people know why that name is significant in the story of Van Gogh. A couple of you know very well why. I have some former students here who know exactly why Gauguin is a big player in this story, and he will come up today. But this is a letter that Van Gogh wrote to Gauguin, and he describes the painting. He does a little picture, and he very clearly says, "Les murs lilas pâles," the pale lilac walls. Now, in a letter to his brother Theo from the day before in mid-October, he says the same thing. He says, "Les murs violet pâle," the pale violet walls. And he also says, "Les portes sont lilas," the doors are lilac. Well, it doesn't look particularly lilac anymore. The reason for that has to do with the pigments. And this is another area where there has been just exciting new technology being used to understand Van Gogh's studio practice and Van Gogh's methods of working through the pigments that he used. And here again, the Van Gogh Museum has been at the forefront of this research. They have partnered with various scientific entities. Even Shell Oil worked with them at one point on this and lent out their labs. And they are able to take teeny tiny little samples from the paintings, small enough it won't hurt them, look at them under various equipment, and see the layers of paint, like cutting through a cake or something. And through that, and through those kinds of analyses, they can work out what was originally there. And it turns out that indeed Van Gogh did use a red pigment in with the blue on the walls and on the door, so that originally it was much more violet than it appears now. The red pigment is fugitive, as we say, meaning that it faded over time. And he was very aware himself that his own pigments, some of them would be prone to fading. He knew that, and he tried to compensate for that in his own studio practice, but it didn't work. Time is what it is. So here on the right, I've got a big reveal. This is the only special effect you're going to see, so don't get too excited. But over here on the right, I have the digital reconstruction done by the Van Gogh Museum of the original colors of the bedroom. Oh, it totally changes the painting, doesn't it? It completely changes how we perceive that work to see it with its original colors. And once you start reading about this, you're surprised to learn how many of his paintings use the fugitive red and have now faded. So for example, the beautiful blossoming almond branch tree with the white flowers, some of those flowers were originally pink. And similarly, there's a beautiful painting in the Met with white flowers. Those flowers were originally pink. So when you go through and read about that and learn about that, you're forced to rethink about the work. And it also puts you in a very interesting way in his studio. That's one of the things I love about this kind of new research, because it allows you to imagine him at work a little more, just thinking about the choices that he is making. A second example I have for you is a fun discovery from about 2012, so again, pretty recent. There on the left is a painting that is in the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, a wonderful, wonderful museum, second largest collection of Van Gogh paintings in the world, after the Van Gogh Museum itself. They have had this painting since the 1930s. So they've had it a really long time. And you see that it is a floral still life. And for a long time, it was assumed to be Van Gogh. It was acquired with that assumption and assumed to date from early summer 1886 when he was living in Paris. So this is before he goes to the south of France. He's living with his brother right now, and I'm sure it was very exciting to be in the apartment with the two of them. But in any case, so this painting here on the left was believed to be a Van Gogh off and on for a long time because its authenticity has sometimes been questioned. Even as recently as 2003, the curators of the Tombolo Museum wondered if they were dealing with an authentic Van Gogh, and even for a bit took it off the list, so to speak, of being authentic. Well, what's the problem? Let's identify that first. So over there on the right, I have 4 other flower paintings that he did while he was in Paris. And it's possible you've never seen any of these before because the famous works are the ones he did in the south of France. But the things he did in Paris are really nifty because that's when he is really working out his relationship with color. And the Dutch period paintings before that have a lot more neutral tones to them, for instance. But in Paris, he was exposed to Impressionism, and he was inspired by that to rethink his own studio practice and his own work. So he used flowers as a way to play with color theory, about which he was very knowledgeable, by the way. He read everything that was published about color theory and was incredibly in tune with that and very familiar with the science of it. And so he used flowers because, first of all, you don't have to pay flowers. Unlike models, you don't have to pay them. And secondly, it allowed him to move flowers around and change them up and do things to get the right color relationships. So these 4 on the right are all undisputably by him. No one has ever questioned any of the 4 on the right, I don't think. The one on the bottom left, for example, in the Orsay is quite famous. But you notice that the one on the left looks a bit different. And I brought my own laser pointer because I'm just that kind of art historian. And I don't know if the people at home can see my red dot, but people here can. And you can see that he's got a bunch of flowers at the bottom, and there's nothing like that in the other 4. There's nothing like that in any of the others, and there are many more beyond these 4. So that's kind of curious. Secondly, the painting on the left is larger in size than the ones on the right. And I don't have this to scale at all, but just believe me, the one on the left is bigger. It's a size that he normally would not use for the subject, so that's curious. Then his signature is here, but it's not in the place where he would normally put his signature if he put one. He didn't always sign his work. When he did, he usually did it at the bottom, but here it's at the top, and the letters look a little bit different than what he normally writes. By the way, he always signs himself Vincent, and we know why, because he says so in one of his letters, that he knew that people outside Holland would never be able to say his name. And was he right, or was he right? So he signed himself Vincent for that reason. Fun facts. Anyway, so there are a few things about this painting that struck people stylistically as being a little curious. Well, as it happens, there's something under the painting on the left. An X-ray revealed, but way back in 1998, so already this X-ray was known, that there is a painting under the painting. And you can do this with X-ray, you can do this with macro scanning. There are a few different techniques that you could use, infrared technology, to see what's under a painting. And X-raying paintings is neat because you can see the process and you can see if there's something else completely. And in this case, there are wrestlers underneath the flowers. So we have 2 men here, and you can tell they're wearing loincloths. And so it's very obvious what we're dealing with when you look at it under the X-ray. And to my mind, when they found this in 1998, they really should have settled it, but it didn't. Somehow, I'm not sure quite why not. Because over here to the right, we have a letter to Theo from Vincent. The letter was written while he was in Antwerp in January 1886. And in this letter, and it's in Dutch, and I can't read Dutch, otherwise I'd find the exact line for you. But in here somewhere, he says, I have been working on I'm paraphrasing, an image of wrestlers, and I'm enjoying it very much. He is in the Drawing Academy right now in Antwerp, taking lessons. He's going to quit the academy shortly, by the way. It doesn't go well. But he is, for a time, taking real classes, which he didn't do very much, in Antwerp. And so he's been assigned to draw models as part of the course. So that is what this would be then in that scenario. So in 2003, again, it's surprising to me that the pendulum sort of swung back towards it not being authentic, because this is a pretty good indicator. Well, the painting was scanned again, much more recently, using other technologies beyond just the simple, old X-ray from the 90s, and it confirmed that indeed this image is really there and gave a little more detail than what you can actually see in this particular image. In addition to that, some research was done into the practices of the Drawing Academy, and the Drawing Academy, as it turns out, required their models to wear loincloths rather than be fully nude. So that's a nice little point in favor of authenticity. And in addition, it was discovered that the size of canvas that was normally used for the students in the Drawing Academy was that size. So the evidence starts to stack up. The technological evidence, the evidence of the letters, the evidence of context of the Drawing Academy, and so on. So if we go back and we look at our painting on the right, we can start to understand why he does some of the things he does. He puts more flowers here because he has to hide the wrestlers. He needs them to be gone, and so he adds more flowers here so they won't peek through and won't be as visible. And now that means he has to put his signature up here. So his choices make a lot of sense when we start looking at it into context. And so this is another terrific example of all those tools being brought together into telling a story of Van Gogh's experience with these paintings. Now, you might be wondering, well, why did he paint over that? Probably because he was out of money. That is the number one reason why you would paint something over. It's also possible he just didn't like it anymore. Maybe he had, I'm just guessing, I'm gonna be fictional for a second. Maybe he was having bad memories about the Drawing Academy because it didn't go well. They didn't pass him to the next level, and he was quite insulted by that. Maybe he was just angry and he just decided to paint over it. We don't know. But he did, and it's actually not the only time he did. There are other paintings of his where there is a painting underneath that he either didn't have the money or he hadn't received canvas yet from his brother or whatever, and he painted over the lost painting. One more example for you, and this one is very fun because it has a twist from 2020, and that has to do with the last painting that Van Gogh ever did. Well, if you know about Van Gogh, if you've watched movies or read books about him, odds are you've heard that his last painting is this one, Wheat Filled with Crows. And for, well, all the way until recently, it has been assumed to be the last painting. Now, just to give you a little background there, the last 70 days of his life were spent at a little village called Auvers-sur-Oise, which is in northern France, just outside of Paris. So he was down in Arles for a year and 3 months. Then he went to Saint-Remy, to the asylum, as you probably know. He was there for about a year. And then he came back up north and went to Auvers, and he was there for 70 days. This village, by the way, is also known as the place Dr. Bundrick would retire if she had the money. It's a beautiful village, and I know that a couple of you here have been there, and it's magical. It's a very special place. And while he was there, in that 70 days, he produced enormous amounts of work. The problem with those works is our source material is quite fuzzy for that time period. He doesn't write as many letters to Theo for a couple of reasons, one of those being that he and Theo actually had a fairly strained relationship during part of that time. And so there aren't as many letters going back and forth. And when he does write, he's not very precise always about what he's working on. So Wheat Filled with Crows, unfortunately, is one of the paintings we can't match to a specific letter and therefore to a specific day. So its chronology is quite amorphous. Because it is this shape, which is known as a double square shape, that puts it in July probably, or June, July, latter half of June and in July. But there are many others, and what order they go has not yet been worked out. It's quite close together in time too, so the canvas thing won't help you. So in any case, it really can go anywhere in that amount of time, I guess is what I mean. So it was very easy for people to assume that that was the last painting. And that idea, which was accepted by scholars for a very long time, was promoted in other venues, like the very famous Lust for Life from 1956, the movie, has the painting here in the last scene with Kirk Douglas in the wheat fields. in Auvers. And it's also mentioned in the novel Lust for Life as well. And in the 1990 movie Vincent and Theo with the delightfully cuckoo Tim Roth. He's like over the top cuckoo in that movie, but it's so fun to watch Tim Roth be cuckoo. Tim Roth in that film, in the last scene, or one of the last scenes, also has this painting on his easel. So in fictional terms, this painting was presented as being the last one. And here it is. It is in the Van Gogh Museum today, and when you go to the Van Gogh Museum, there's always a little crowd around this one because people know it and people believe it is the last painting. But in fact, in 2012, a very interesting paper was published by two scholars affiliated with the Van Gogh Museum that made a completely different argument. And they suggested that this is the last painting by Van Gogh, and it is known today as Tree Roots. You see that it is the same double square format as the Wheat Filled with Crows, and like Wheat Filled with Crows, we cannot pin it down chronologically using other source material like a letter. So it also is up for grabs, except for one very important detail. This painting is not finished. And I know it looks pretty finished when you see it here, but it just is not finished. There are layers here that are left to be done. There are bits of canvas peeking through here and there. It is not a finished work. There's only one other painting from Auvers that is also unfinished, and it shows cottages. So there are two that are unfinished out of all of those paintings from those 70 days. For there to be two is not odd. He often did work on 2 or 3 at the same time. So for him to have 2 unfinished paintings going at the same time is not odd at all for him, for his practice. So the fact that it is unfinished is a very good indicator that perhaps this indeed is the last work. And what we're looking at here, it looks very abstract and it looks very modern in a lot of ways. And the way this painting has often been talked about is as almost like a precursor for modern art of the 20th century because it does look incredibly abstract. But we are looking at a close-in view of Tree Roots. Now, Wheat Filled with Crows, in contrast, is this fantastic panoramic view. And this does look incredibly ominous. It's very easy to read things into this painting, no kidding. We have this crossroads here, we have the stormy sky, we have the crows. And so definitely with the benefit of hindsight, we can look at this and feel that maybe something here is rather unsettling. The Tree Roots, this very close-in view, is very different, and that is incredibly intriguing. And this isn't the only time he ever did this. Many times in his career, he would choose a subject and just zoom in on it. This is very inspired to him by his love of Japanese prints in a very big way, this very close-in sorts of views. So he's tackling the subject and really looking at it. Well, in 2012, this paper suggested that this is the last work. And then that idea was developed a little further in a 2013 paper as well. And this isn't the only time that he ever painted tree roots. I just want to show it to you because I love it. This beautiful drawing from 1882, so from several years earlier when he's still living in Holland. He's still learning to draw at this point, but this is a gorgeous work. And this work we do know a bit about because we have a letter where he talks about it to his brother. And here's a little quote for you. Frantically and fervently rooting itself, talking about the tree, as it were in the earth, and yet being half torn up by the storm, I wanted to express something of life's struggle. And he pairs this with another drawing he's done around the same time of his live-in lover at the time, Zine Hornig. And he relates her struggles in life to those of the tree. So the roots for him very clearly in 1882 had this strong metaphorical meaning of him, of struggle, but at the same time clinging to the earth. And as it happens, while he is in Auvers, that last month of his life, his relationship with his brother is a bit strained. He's worried that his illness is never going to go away, that he's never going to recover. He's worried about money. He's worried about his brother's health. Theo was ill also at the time. It was just not a good time for him at all, and that is a huge understatement. And at one point in a letter, he talks about his life is being attacked at the very root. Now, that letter has no connection to this painting. He doesn't mention that painting in that letter, but that metaphor of the roots comes back. And the Van Gogh Museum scholars who made this argument about this painting suggested that this work is telling us that symbolically and indicating his struggles and his anxieties at that point in his life through paint. And if they're right, this is the last painting he did. This is the last painting he was working on. And if you know what happened, then you know that on this day, January 27th, 1890, is when he wounded himself. And then he would die on July 29th. So if this was the last work, it has its own very powerful meaning to it. But here is the 2020 twist. Of course, there's a 2020 twist. And ironically, this happened during lockdown, apparently. And I have to tell you, of all the recent discoveries there have been about Van Gogh, this one got me the most excited. I was just thrilled when I heard about this. It was all in the news. Maybe some of you saw it last April or May. So the scholar in question is an independent scholar named Wouter van der Veen. He's a Dutch scholar. He does do things with the Van Gogh Museum. And he is affiliated with the Institut Van Gogh in Auvers-sur-Oise. So he's very steeped in Van Gogh. And the way he has told the story, apparently, is that he was digitizing old postcards from Auvers during lockdown, because what else are you going to do? And he happened to just look at this one more carefully when it was on his computer screen, this image from around 1900, 1910. This shows Rue d'Aubigny. This spot is right around the corner from the inn where Vincent was staying at the time, and van der Veen noted the pattern of the roots over here to the right and was very intrigued by this. And so apparently, as soon as he was able, he went to, lockdown allowed, he went to Auvers. The hillside here was covered in weeds and plants and things, but apparently he talked to the owner of the land, had it cleared, and this is what it looked like in May 2020. Then what he did, and this is the kind of thing I just love, detective work, par excellence. He consulted with the scholars, his colleagues at the Van Gogh Museum, and they were very excited. He consulted with a dendrochronologist to learn about these trees and what these may have looked like in 1890 to get a feel for if it was plausible. And the consensus among all of those involved is that this is very likely, you can't prove it, but very likely the exact spot of the tree roots. And van der Veen has published this wonderful image where the painting is juxtaposed with this hillside. And apparently now at Auvers, there is a sign right there at the spot. If you go to Auvers, there are signs everywhere for where Van Gogh's paintings were done, and you can stand in the spot of his alleged last painting. So another really great example of everything sort of coming together. So that's the left brain side of things. Well, the right brain side of things and the right brain way of entering into Van Gogh's world is a whole other story. And just to bring up a couple of examples, of course, the book Lust for Life preceded the movie by many years. The book was published in 1934 during the Great Depression, and it became a huge national bestseller, partly because it was the Great Depression and because American readers identified very strongly with Van Gogh's story of struggles, and he became this hero in the US. It was around that time as well, a couple of years after the book was published, that MoMA acquired Starry Night, and MoMA sent some Van Gogh paintings on tour around the country. So in America, Van Gogh's popularity can definitely be said to spring from the 1930s. And Lust for Life, I think, had a lot to do with that. But since then, there have been so many different treatments of Van Gogh in books and on film and in all sorts of venues. And I'm often asked, well, which one's your favorite? Dr. Bundrick, which one do you like the best? I mean, which one is your Vincent? Well, I like the one on the right the best, Doctor Who. And that might surprise you, because if you know the premise of the Doctor Who TV series, I have to be honest with you, this is the only episode I've ever seen. But I watched it when it premiered that night because I was not going to miss it. And I was blown away because the Vincent in the Vincent and the Doctor episode was my Vincent. My book had come out 6 months earlier, and so I'm not ashamed to say I just cried at the end. And if you've seen this episode, you know why people cry at the end of this episode. If you've never watched Doctor Who before, watch this episode. It's worth seeing. It is a science fiction show, so get ready for that. No one would accuse it of being accurate in any way because it is a science fiction show. However, it's very apparent that Richard Curtis, who was the screenwriter, and of course Richard Curtis has written lots of wonderful Hollywood films, was very knowledgeable about the source material and used it in interesting ways. I'm not one of those people that's going to complain about things being accurate unless it's just something really, really wrong, and then it bugs me. But this was fun, and it was original, and I love it. I think it's fantastic. So that is the Vincent that I do like the best of all the fictional ones, other than, of course, mine. I mean, I guess I should say that. But you know, Tim Roth, I adore Tim Roth, but it's a little over the top. You know, Kirk Douglas, I adore Kirk Douglas, but that film is very much a product of its time in a lot of ways. I like that guy, I gotta tell you. So what about my book? What about my book? You know, it's so funny because it did come out a while ago, and yet when I was working on this talk and thinking about the experiences I had writing this book and meeting people and going to people's houses for book club, as it turns out, someone whose house I went to in 2010 for book club came to see me tonight, which was so sweet, and we had such a good time. We had so much fun. That was such a lovely experience for me because I am an academic writer mostly, so this was a total departure and very, very unexpected, and I can't even really fully explain how it all came about, honestly. And it all did begin in Auvers for me. This is a view of the crossroads of where the crows were, and in Auvers, and this, I think this picture is from 2007 or so, so before I'd already been writing the book by this point. But it was for me the power of place and the power of the works themselves that got me very inspired and got me thinking about him. And I have to tell you, the biggest challenge working on this project was letting go of my inner art history professor. The first draft was awful. First draft, my character, who is the narrator, sounded like she was lecturing, and that's just not what you want for a story of that kind. My character, that is my narrator, is Rachel, or Rachel, the girl to whom he gave the piece of his ear on December 23rd, 1888. So I had to get into her head and get into the world of Van Gogh in the south of France and all of these people who were around him. So that meant, on the one hand, it was incredibly liberating, and I got to plunge myself into that and think about different questions. So there, for example, on the right is an unfinished work from October 1888. It's a little sketch. He never turned it into a big painting. Why not? Who is that girl in the yellow dress? Well, she could be whoever I want her to be if I'm writing a novel. And it turned out she was my character, I decided. There on the left is the self-portrait I had on my inspiration board. Of all the self-portraits, this is my favorite one. It was the look in his eyes. These sorts of things got me thinking about Van Gogh's world and Van Gogh's experiences in a totally different way. The most fun I had was writing Gauguin, because I don't like him. And my character didn't like him either, as it turned out. Rachel in the story is incredibly suspicious of him as soon as she meets him, and with good reason, as it turns out. I mean, look at him. I mean, it practically writes itself. So I had so much fun. I was laughing to myself at my computer. He took over every scene he showed up in. And I got to turn whole scenes out of my favorite paintings. It was so free. It's such a liberating thing to do. But at the same time, going into Van Gogh's world like that, in this incredibly creative right brain way, still means being very responsible. So I had to keep my left brain engaged during this whole thing and be responsible to the scholarship, first of all, because I needed to look up things like, where was the stove in his house? And amazingly, I was able to find that out. I couldn't believe it. These very obscure things that I never thought I'd be able to discover are out there somewhere in the vast world of Van Gogh scholarship. So the challenge was for me to find these details and get the chronology and all of these things, and then play with it while still staying responsible to the truth. This was very, very important to me as an academic. And in fact, I'm such a nerd. At the back of my book, you will find a bibliography. You will find a list of paintings that are discussed in the novel, and not one but two historical essays telling you exactly what I changed, because I felt that I couldn't deceive people, and I had to be honest about anything I was doing and what was real and what wasn't. So there was play with a PS to it, I would say. And I did go to Arles, I did go to Saint-Remy, I did go back to Auvers, and immersed myself in his world through the power of place, and saw as many works in person as I could in order to be able to get to that spot, but remaining responsible to scholarship, and also remaining responsible to him. This was really important to me as well. I did not want to betray him, and that sounds odd, but I mean that, and particularly regarding his illness. I did not want to be sensationalist about his illness. I did not want to be disrespectful about his experiences or be campy or make him over the top the way that I adore Tim Roth, but he's so cuckoo in that movie. That's just too much. That was not the Vincent that I felt I had gotten to know through reading his letters and reading his own experiences of his illness. He was very self-aware of his own condition, even if he didn't know what to call it exactly. He knew what was happening to him, so as much as he could know. And so I felt an enormous responsibility to be true to him and to be honest and to not make it into something that would be disrespectful in some way. So that level of responsibility that was intertwined with all the fun and the freedom and the liberation of building this great story was something I took very, very seriously. And hopefully it comes across in the book that I did feel that way and that I wanted to convey that sort of story. But at the same time, I didn't want the illness to take over, and it doesn't. So I wanted to imagine what it was like for my character, Rachel, to be there watching him paint. This one's not in the book. I just love it, so I brought it in because I wanted to show it to you on the big screen. But so many paintings are in there, and it was just such a fantastic experience being able to plunge into his world in that way and to share my love for the work through the characters who are looking at it and through the characters who experience it, and through him as he is working it, and to imagine myself there as well. I want to leave you with a fantastic quote, and I had a really hard time picking which quote I was going to share with you from the letters, because they're just filled with great and wonderful things. And if I were to urge you to do anything, it would be, well, I guess read my book. And secondly, read his letters, because his letters inspired me. And through his letters, that's the best way to get to know him. And by the way, and pull up the handwriting as well, because you learn a lot just from his handwriting. You can tell when he's really excited, his handwriting speeds up. You can get to see that in the letters. Anyway, so this is the quote that I chose for you to carry with you out in the world and maybe take with you up to the exhibit. He's writing this in July 1882 while he's living in The Hague. He's still drawing, he's learning. He has not launched into painting yet, so he's trying to get his drawings right. And he's writing to his brother, and he's talking about that. And this is what he says: "What I want and set as my goal is damned difficult, and yet I don't believe I am aiming too high. I want to make drawings that move some people. In short, I want to reach the point where people say of my work, that man feels deeply, and that man feels subtly." I think that's what people see in him. When I ask myself, why him? What is it about him and his work that people feel so drawn to? I think people feel that they can relate to him. They see the beautiful colors. They relate on an aesthetic level. But then they relate to him and they see something in the work that draws them. And I was hearing from Peter before the talk that so many people have been coming to this museum to see the exhibit that they are selling out of tickets constantly. And it's just incredible how many have come. And it doesn't surprise me one bit. And I think the reason is because people do see that. People do see how much he felt, and it comes across in his work so strongly that people want to be part of that world too. Thank you. By the way, sorry, Kim, the book that I was talking about from 2020 by Wouter van der Veen with his discovery of the location of the painting is available open access online. And he's made that available for you to read and download for free. So it's called Attacked at the Very Root. It's the last entry down here. And you can Google it and find it and download. It's a not too long of a book, and it's fantastic, and it will tell you about his discovery and give you all the details that I did very fast. So I did want to make you know about that one because it is open access. Okay, Kim, sorry.
I know people here probably have some questions.
Great.
One of them is, would Van Gogh begin landscape paintings on plein air and then finish them back in the studio?
Yes, a lot of the time he would. In fact, he preferred to work on site whenever he could. And he felt that that was the way to best get at the subject, by being there with the subject. Now, sometimes this was very hard for him. So, for example, in the south of France, there is that notorious north wind called the Mistral that comes down, and we would call it tropical storm force down here in Florida, and that's about right, but it's really cold wind, and it was incredibly disruptive to his work. So there were times when the weather would not cooperate and when he couldn't do the painting fully on site. Now, that being said, and he would sometimes then finish it in the studio, but for as much as possible, he'd do it on plein air. At the same time, however, he did have points where he wanted to experiment with doing paintings totally from his head, including landscapes. And that is a big influence from Gauguin. Gauguin, as you may know, came to live in Arles for about 10 weeks in late 1888. It did not go well, would be the kind of big understatement there. And they argued a lot, and one of the things they argued about was artistic practice. Gauguin believed that a true artist should get it totally from their head. So Vincent did try that, and there are works that were done from his head, like Starry Night. The famous Starry Night was done totally from his head. But he wasn't usually satisfied with the results, and it wasn't his preferred painting practice. That's a fantastic question. Can I call on her? Yeah. Okay.
At the beginning, you said you were using American pronunciation of his name, Van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
How did he say his name?
I can't speak Dutch, but so I'm going to get it kind of wrong, but it's something like Van Gogh. And the French say Van Gogh. The French say Van Gogh, Vincent Van Gogh. Well, like a Gogue, Van Gogh, Van Gogh. But Dutch, it's more like Van Gogh. And I'm probably doing it all wrong. I apologize, Dutch speakers.
So there's no F on the end, like the GH in enough?
No, mm-mm.
Never that?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Yes?
You appeared to not accept the concept that maybe in the end 2 children teasing him.
Knew I was going to get this one. Well, I am going to give the short answer to that because I could give a much longer answer to that. What our questioner is referring to is a theory that was published in 2011 that suggested that his being shot was an accident, that it was the result of a chance encounter with 2 teenagers who were kind of hanging around over there, and that it was all essentially an accident, and that he did not, in fact, intend to commit suicide. Well, I will actually let the Van Gogh Museum speak for me a little bit because they don't believe that at all. And I would say the majority of Van Gogh scholars do not accept that story. And when that book came out, I read it and I also did not agree with it, and for the same reasons as others. I mean, I am not a Van Gogh scholar, but nonetheless, the evidence just is not there to support that story. And the evidence in favor of him having done it himself is circumstantial, but it's pretty strong. First of all, he himself he himself said he did it. He said he did it on his deathbed, and he told his brother that, so we're told. And there are other sorts of evidence. For example, the reports of the wound, and I'm sorry, this is getting kind of graphic, but the reports of the wound to his chest from the time suggest something that was done at very close range, as if he'd done it to himself. And so there are things like that in terms of documentary evidence, his own words, and other sorts of evidence that seem to point more towards him having done it to himself. It's also true that he was having an incredibly difficult time. In those weeks, he was losing hope, I think is a good way to put it, and things were just, it was not a good time, so the motivation would have been there. That comes across in the sources, and I think people want it not to be true. People want him not to have done it to himself. And I think that is why that theory has been latched onto as much as it has. But you can go to the Van Gogh Museum website, and they have a pretty, unless they've taken it down, I don't think they have, but once that book came out, the next day they put up a whole thing. And they're in a weird position because nobody likes to be arguing in favor of him having done it to himself. No one enjoys that, but that's where the evidence points to. So no, I don't accept that theory. That's the short version of the explanation.
There's one other question from online.
Okay.
What is the most surprising thing you learned about Van Gogh personally that you have not mentioned tonight in the lecture?
Oh, gosh. Wow. Well, I will say that a long time ago, so not really to do with the book research, but more when I started to get to know him a long time ago, something that surprised me, and I think surprises a lot of people when they learn it about him, is just how much of a reader he was. I love this about him. He read all the time. I don't know when he slept because he was painting, he was writing letters, and he was reading. And we know a lot about his reading habits because he told his brother what he was reading. So he would send these little notes to his brother or to his sister and say, well, I'm reading da-da-da book and da-da-da-da, you should read this book. Or I read this book and this is a passage that I really like from this book. And there's just so much of that. And he read in many languages. He could read Dutch, French, English, and a little bit of German as well. So he read Shakespeare in the original. He loved Uncle Tom's Cabin, was one of his favorite books. He was a huge fan of Charles Dickens, is another author he really loved. Among French authors, he loved Émile Zola. He read pretty much everything by Zola. I loved that about him. I loved learning that he was that much of a reader. And it somehow seemed different than the image people sometimes have of him, which is of this, madman in the attic and all this. That's just not what happened. And that's not what he was like. Even when he was struck with illness, it came and went. And so there were times when he was perfectly lucid. But his reading habits just blew my mind. So I would say that was something I was surprised by and loved when I learned that about him. That's a fantastic question. I'm sure I'll think about 5 more when I leave, but the reader in him is the one I'll pick for now. Yes?
Did the fact that he had a brother named the same name that died before he was born affect his mental?
That is a theory that I believe was talked about a lot in a 1972 book called Stranger on This Earth, which I admit I have not read. That book has been very influential. I think we have to be, and I'm speaking with my own opinion here, very cautious about psychological readings like that. When the evidence is not there, because he doesn't actually mention anything like that in any of his letters. So I think that kind of reading, or I'm not going to say the name of the book. I'm not going to do it. Another recent book that had a very psychological element to it. One has to be very careful and not read things that aren't there. I tend personally to take him at his word, recognizing that his letters are written for an audience and he's picking and choosing what to say in the letter. Nonetheless, I personally am very cautious about going off on too many psychological limbs when the evidence just isn't there. And that to me that's part of my desire not to be disrespectful of him. So I tend to be very cautious in the way that I look at him and the way I look at the evidence. So I personally would want to see more evidence before I would accept a theory like that. That's a diplomatic answer. Yes?
We hear so many stories of his struggles,
Mm-hmm.
his career struggles, his only selling one painting struggle, all
Mm-hmm.
of his struggles. Was he happy? Did he have happy times?
I think he did. And I think he was happy when his work was going well. I think, talking about entering Van Gogh's world, I think he entered into his art in such a way that when it went well, it made him happy. So I imagined him, and this again is the right brain, but I imagined him getting very excited about and very enthused about a subject. And going back to the letters and the handwriting, and I don't read Dutch, but I do read French, and I got to be able to read his handwriting decently well as time went on because I just wanted to be able to read it. And you could tell when he's excited because a letter to Theo will start with this very tidy handwriting. He's obviously trying really hard to make it nice and neat, and then he starts getting excited. It speeds up. Words get big. He'll underline things, and you could just see it in his hand writing the letter when he's talking about a painting, when he's talking about something that he's excited about with the subject. It's there in his handwriting. So I see it there in the physical handwriting. But even in the text of the letters, he speaks sometimes about subjects in a way that is clear how excited he is about it. But I mean, there is no getting around the fact that he did have a lot of struggles. But I think he did have those moments of happiness. And honestly, in my book, that's what I wanted to give him. Was I wanted to give him those moments of happiness.
Another question that just came in. They're hot off the presses.
I love it. Keep it coming. Keep it coming.
This question's really interesting in terms of obviously separating the fictional persona that you created
Okay.
from the actual person who was the recipient. So do we know how the real life Rochelle reacted when Van Gogh presented her with his ear?
You know, the story of Rochelle is so fascinating. It's actually become even more fascinating. I'm glad someone asked this because I almost brought it in and then I knew that I would go for like hours. So when I wrote my book in 2009, there was very little to go on. It's actually in the historical essay at the back of the book. Some of the evidence is laid out in much more detail than I have time to talk about now. But there are newspaper accounts of the day, but they contradict each other a little bit. But one of them says that she fainted. I mean, of course she did. But the other than she herself, at that time, the knowledge of her was just not known. It was assumed she was a prostitute. That's how she was described in the newspaper account. She was talked about as being a girl that lived in the house, in the brothel. And so that's the character that I created. And the records from that brothel exist because prostitution was legal. You had to register with the police. And so there were records of the residents of the brothel that at that time were sealed. And I think they still are. So I didn't have much to go on, which let me go wild, which was really great. A few years ago, what year would this have been? 2017 maybe? 2018, a book came out called Van Gogh's Ear. And the woman who wrote it is named Bernadette Murphy. She is an independent scholar. She's actually a school teacher, I think. She lives in Arles. She's a British expat. And she decided to track down who Rochelle is. And incredibly, she came up with very, very good evidence. And so I would encourage you to read that book if you want to know. And it turns out that if she's right, truth is even more interesting than fiction, because the girl that she tracked down as being her candidate for the real Rochelle was a girl who was working as a servant in the brothel. And she was someone who was disfigured because she'd been attacked by a dog. So she had, I think it was one of her arms. She had disfiguring scars. She actually had to go to Paris for surgeries. And so in her book, Ms. Murphy suggests that that's one of the things that Van Gogh was drawn to in her, that this was a young girl who was scarred and was disfigured and who had been through so much that he felt a kinship with her in some way. And that it wasn't a romantic relationship, she was too young, but rather that she was just someone that he knew. But any more than that, she couldn't know, but that at least is this theory that's out there about who she is. And that same theory was picked up in Martin Bailey's book called Studio of the South. I think that's the one. Martin Bailey has written a few books, and now I've forgotten which one is the one where he talks about Rochelle, but I think it's the one called Studio of the South, and he picks up on Miss Murphy's evidence and kind of builds on that a little bit. So there is now a candidate for who she really is. But I had very little to go on, so I just got to make her up, which was a lot of fun.
I have one last question.
Okay.
This is, obviously, we don't want to lean too heavily, as you rightly suggest, on psychological evidence that doesn't exist. But there have also been several studies that have come out that have tried a kind of more diagnostic angle. And I was wondering, from your own research and reading of his letters, and as you said, he was pretty forthright about what he was feeling. Do you feel that there's any more or less valid diagnostic explanation for his illness?
Well, there have been so many of those, lots of different theories, some more plausible than others. Some of them are just honestly quite silly. But the theory at the time was that it was a form of frontal lobe epilepsy. And that theory is still kind of around, honestly, and there's still scholars who believe that. In fact, they had a big conference at the Van Gogh Museum a few years ago where all of these medical people tried to diagnose him, and they couldn't come to a consensus. So we may never come to a consensus if they can't. So I'm not going to sit here and try to do it. But because the symptoms that are described not just by him, but in other sorts of documents, including letters from his doctors to his brother that describe what is happening, and letters from his pastor, not his pastor, but a pastor who acted as a sort of was a friend of his, and also preserved some of this information. So things like he tried to eat his paints, and he had hallucinations, and it would come and go. It would be a period. One time it was 6 weeks, another time it was 8 weeks, one time it was 2 weeks. These periods where he couldn't paint, he couldn't work, he couldn't sleep, and he would drink turpentine, and he would just cry. He would just weep for hours and have these horrible, horrible nightmares. And then it would go away. And then he'd be fine, and he'd be able to work, and he would be able to write letters, and it came and went. So the coming and going is one of the things that has stumped people. But apparently, not a doctor, frontal lobe epilepsy is one of those that some of the symptoms fit. Another one that some of the symptoms fit is bipolar disorder. And one of the things that I found intriguing when I was researching the book, when I did want to at least come up with an idea so that I could work with that, I was struck by what appeared to be, and I'm not the first person to notice this by any stretch, that there were emotional triggers right before each of his episodes. So for example, a scholar named Martin Gayford discovered that, or made a very good case, that just before December 23rd, 1888, when he had his first very serious breakdown and did cut off part of his ear, that it was triggered by the news of his brother's engagement. His brother had just gotten engaged to Johanna, and that perhaps this precipitated some very deep anxiety in Vincent because, as you probably know, Theo was financially supporting him. He was also incredibly close to his brother to the extent that he may have felt some sort of rupture in the relationship because of this, or some sort of threat. So that is just before a major breakdown. Another one of his major breakdowns in spring 1889 comes just after his brother's son is born. Now, Vincent adored his nephew, and in fact, Vincent painted this for his nephew when he was born. So it's not that Vincent didn't want his brother to be happy and was not excited about his brother having a child. I got the impression in my research and just reading that Vincent started to feel more and more that he was a burden on his brother. And so because his brother had a family and his brother was going through things, his brother eventually, his health was getting worse and worse. Theo died of syphilis 6 months after Vincent, actually. So Theo's health was getting worse and worse in 1890. I'm sorry, I said 1889, I meant 1890. One of his serious breakdowns, the one when the son was born, was just after this painting. Well, while this painting was in progress, excuse me. So I noticed links, and again, I'm not the only one, between emotional triggers that then launch into an episode. Now, for a couple of those, we don't know what the trigger was, so I created one. And I created one, in at least one instance, I created the trigger in my book. But I'm very honest at the end that I totally made it up. So that is the bipolar disorder suggestion, ties into that some sort of emotional trigger might precipitate the episode. But again, this conference, they came to no consensus, these international team of experts, which is really fascinating. There was an exhibition at the Van Gogh Museum a couple of years ago. The years all run together now, I'm sorry. I think it was 2018, and it's called, I think it's just called Van Gogh's Insanity. You'd think I'd be able to conjure up these titles like that, sorry. I think it's called Van Gogh's Insanity, and that book is out and about and probably still obtainable. And it was an exhibition the Van Gogh Museum held, and examining this problem, the conference was part of that exhibition. And in the book, they outline some of the theories, and they give the timeline and various things. And on their website, the Van Gogh Museum is really great with their multimedia presence. So their website has so much information on a lot of these questions too. I'm not being the scholar of Van Gogh, I defer to them because they are the, kind of the authority on him for sure.
I'd like to thank you again for this amazing presentation. It was just wonderful.
Thank you. I want to thank the socially distanced and masked audience for coming here and being with me tonight, including former students that are in the room and former book club hosts in the room, and people that I know. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone watching at home. It's lovely to have you. I'm so excited. It was such a treat to share him with you tonight. So thank you very much.
Not your last time to come and talk at the museum.
Well, since I normally work on Greek art, when they have an exhibit about Greek pottery, sign me up. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something there we could work with. Oh, thank you.